All right, so this is a talk I'm calling the WordPress Hacker's Guide to the Galaxy. You may have noticed there's a room downstairs, room 42, and this talk is not in that room, and I think that's really sad. It's a missed opportunity based on the name of the talk, but we'll move on anyway. My name's Jason. This is my information if you want to look me up, decide if I'm worth listening to. I'm used to having the next slide on my screen, but because I have to mirror my displays, I'm not getting that. So I may be as surprised as you are with each new slide. So I'm from Baltimore, which is right there. And when I say that, I'm pretty sure what you guys are thinking is that. I am not from that part of Baltimore necessarily, way down deep in the city. But I like Baltimore a lot. I'd rather focus on this other part of our city, which is the Orioles. I'm a big fan. So if you decide to follow me on Twitter, which, let the record show, I didn't actually tell you to do that, but if you wanted to, you'd be faced with a lot of really annoying tweets about the Orioles. I work at Johns Hopkins University. I'm a developer there. I actually don't do much WordPress there, so I don't want you to think that I'm coming from a world where all I know is WordPress. I used to do a lot, do some once in a while, but we're mostly doing Slim applications and a couple other smaller framework. So this is just a bit of what we're doing. What I do at Johns Hopkins is mostly try to solve this problem. If you're familiar with this XKCD cartoon, university websites and applications are terrible. Maybe most industries would say that about themselves, but unfortunately, what we want to put on our website is never what anyone's actually looking for. So we're trying to build applications that create data structures that are available for the whole university so that we can solve this problem and make our information better. So this is a conversation I've had multiple times in the last couple of weeks where I say I'm giving a talk. You would say, oh, cool, what's it about? I'd say WordPress, and there'd be an awkward pause, and you'd wish that you hadn't asked me, and then I'd see that look of despair and depression on your face. So you guys are here, so maybe you don't feel that way, but I just kind of want to talk about how WordPress is perceived really quickly. I did an informal poll on IRC asking people to describe WordPress. You can read these for yourselves if you can read them. The general idea here is not positive. So that's what I'll just leave you with. What I want to say is that WordPress actually has some bad parts, like everything, but it's really not completely evil, okay? So I'll cede that it's kind of bad, but it's not totally bad, and it's all over. It's running something like 80% of the internet now, or some crazy number. It's a ton of traffic going through WordPress sites. We all have to deal with it. Also, what you may not realize, or what many people seem to not realize, is that WordPress is PHP. Excuse me. So we write PHP. Maybe we can find a way to do something together with WordPress here. WordPress is also code, and I mention that because I think the important thing to remember here is that writing better code makes you writing better PHP, which therefore leads to better WordPress if you do it right. So I'm going to focus in on a little guide of the things that you can do inside of a WordPress context. I'm only going to touch on a few of them, where you can write really good, you might debate with me, but debatably good code inside of WordPress using really cool things from 5.3. You don't have to write just this kind of nest of global functions that you normally see if you ever look at a WordPress plugin. So before we even move on, can I just have a show of hands? How many people use WordPress on a regular basis? And of those people, how many of you guys are actually writing like development code, not themes or just using the backend, but actually writing code for it? Okay, great. So if you're not, or if you're just kind of new picking it up, I avoided, these are symbols for the command line on the left and for version control on the right, or specifically Git. When I first started out, I avoided these things thinking that they were way too technical for way too long. So I'm not going to talk about this very long. All I want to say is you are doing yourself a disservice if you're writing any amount of code and you don't know these two things, even just minimally. Most of the rest of the things I talk about today are going to reference if you know Git or if you use the command line, you can do this. So if you don't know these things, oh, actually, see, I told you I'm going to be surprised by my slides. We'll just sit back here. The reason that you want to use this is because they make you an incredibly powerful person. And I imagine that this man feels incredibly powerful every time he puts this suit on. So I just wanted to put that out there for you. I'll actually have a link at the end if you want to buy that costume. There's an actual link you can buy it. If you don't know the command line, this is a great way to learn it. It's it's Zed Shah's Learn Code the Hard Way version. You can get through it in about a week or two, and it's a really good baseline primer. You'll know just enough to get started. If you don't know any version control, I recommend learning Git. I think it's the one to learn right now, especially with how GitHub is built on it, and you can just learn so much about code. WordPress itself is managed inside of Subversion, the actual code itself, but many of the core developers actually store all their code on GitHub. And you'll see in a few minutes, they've actually got a mirrored copy of official WordPress on GitHub that syncs with Subversion every 15 minutes. So you can pull that into your projects. So on to the guide here. First thing we're going to do is something really exciting. It's folder structure. I know you guys are really, really awesome thinking about this. This is how you would see normally a WordPress folder structure. And you don't normally get too much of an option as far as what else you're going to do here. You've got your WordPress files. This WP content file is the most important to kind of point out if you don't know what's in there. That's right. This is all of your plugins, all of your themes, and all of the uploaded files. Basically anything that you don't want to overwrite when you upload WordPress. It's kind of a weird mixture of things. If you're trying to organize a regular application, you wouldn't put your modules and your views and all your uploaded files just in one big folder. But that's what they do because of the upgrade system. Then you got your config and a bunch of other WP files. The only thing that you can really do normally, that I see people do on a regular basis, is just move all that stuff into a WordPress folder and just have your index file outside of it. What I want to say is if you want to organize your code like the way that we normally organize applications, you're not going to get all the way there. But I want to introduce you to a guy here. If you don't know him, if you're writing any WordPress code, his name is Mark Jaquith. He's a core developer, and he's really brilliant. He does some really, really amazing things with WordPress. If you read his blog, there's a lot of really cool ideas. He put up this little skeleton. He calls it the WordPress skeleton. It's on GitHub. I'll have a link for it, and all these links will be in my notes at the end. It's a totally different organization. I'm not going to get too far into it, but I want to point out two things that he does. One is, if you see this right here, WordPress is a submodule, all it's by itself. So you never have to touch that code at all. You can upgrade it, you can do whatever you want with it. It's just pointing to that WordPress version on GitHub. So because they have a mirrored copy, you can point to a specific version, and you can have an exact copy of WordPress just pulled right into your repository, and it manages completely outside. The two problems you're going to run into that with that are your WP config file, all the database configuration, all that stuff. It's inside of the WordPress folder usually. But WordPress, by default, if you don't realize, will actually look for that file one directory up if you don't have it inside of the main directory. So we just move that here, and you can do all your configuration in your root. The other thing is this file, which I'm going to skip and just kind of zoom in. That WP content folder I was telling you about, you can actually define where that is and what it's called. So you can move that wherever you want to. So you can see what he did here. He's got this content folder, which is also outside of the main WordPress repository. And now you've got all your stuff that you're dealing with outside of that, and WordPress itself is in the submodule. It's pretty nice. I like to go a step further. This is starting to get a little bit closer to how I like to organize my applications. So now I have a config folder and a public folder that I point my web root at. All the WordPress stuff's in here. If you did some work, you could probably move this config file up into the config folder. It's a little bit harder to do that, but you could do it pretty easily. So this is like more of how an application might be structured. It's not specific to WordPress, but it's using all the WordPress stuff. And you can imagine, if you wanted to put a vendor folder and start using composer libraries, which we'll kind of touch on in a little bit, you can do that too. You can have all your other stuff outside of here as well, and have it organized in the way you're familiar with. Let's skip that. So now you're super sleepy, talking about WordPress folder structure, and try to wake up here. Let's write some plugin code and see how this works. Yeah, and I want to say, plugins are what we write. Okay, do not put code in the functions.php. That is a file in the theme for theme stuff only. So if you're doing something that's very specific to the theme, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about writing code for the application. So that stuff does not belong in functions.php. When I first started writing, this was one of my first, I actually went and grabbed it, this was one of my first functions.php files. And I'm actually lying to you, that's together actually the whole file right there. You can see why functions.php, you can obviously organize this better than I did, but it's kind of just an invitation to have terribly organized code. And a lot of other disadvantages that we'll kind of get into here. But write code in plugins. Plugins are put in that plugins folder inside of that content folder. You can either do one file or you can put a folder with files in it. WordPress is smart enough to look inside and find the information it needs to determine which files are plugins. All right, so what we're going to do today, this is my new startup. So the theme of my talk was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I'm going to start it where I'm trying to match hikers with spaceships, trying to make sure they get all matched up right. So this is the site, and we're going to write some code today. I've got the hikers here, and that's all set up, but we want to write a piece about the spaceship part we don't have yet. So let's pull that up. So this is a plugin. Can you guys see this okay? Okay. So this is how a plugin would normally be set up. You've got a bunch of stuff. If you're familiar with something like Jekyll, this is kind of like YAML front matter. It's just text at the top of the page. WordPress has an API that pulls it out, parses it, and finds all these key values here. So these are the ones that you would normally put up. This is kind of just a default system here. And if you're normally writing plugins, you just write a function inside of this file, and WordPress just executes it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use WordPress's custom post types, and we're going to make a custom content type called spaceships. So normally all you would do there is you just use their register post type function, and that just gets a name, so spaceships. And then you can do an array of options. I know that if we don't set public to true, it won't show up, so I'll just set that. And that's really the only option you really need out of the gate. So if I save that, it's going to run, it's going to execute in the flow here. And here are all my plugins. I've got the spaceships plugin activated. And if I refresh over here, oh, look at that. What do we got? All right, so we're going to just switch over here. What's that? That's right. All right, so what we end up with is this file, and I'm going to touch on this part here. What we got was we got public true, and oh right, it didn't add the action. So this is what I actually want to talk about. So in order to get anything working in WordPress, you do this thing where you add actions and pass it a callable. So you have to say, basically an event structure or a hook structure. On init, I want you to run this function. But normally what it's doing is it's saying, run this global function that you have to, just by convention, use some sort of unique namespacing on your global function. So we're going to try to fix that. So I'm going to skip over this part here. The difference between actions and filters. Does anyone know that? You can do add action or add filter in WordPress. The difference really is filters filter. That's really, like, if you look up, that's often what the answer is. What they mean by it is it gets content in, like a title or whatever the content is from the post or something like that, and it changes something and puts it back. You're not supposed to do that in an action. So that's kind of the only difference. They're running like the same kind of thing. Actions do everything else. So what we're going to do is actions. And this is how you add an action. For the longest time, it seemed like I thought all you could do was just pass a global function name, but this is just any callable. So another example of a callable is an array where you have an object and a method name on that object. So we're going to show you what that means here. So we're going to use some object-oriented. If you were here for the last talk, they kind of gave a primer on object-oriented programming. If you looked at that code I showed you, a lot of code showed up when I cheated here. In order to get all the labels set up in WordPress for your custom content type, you have to pass in this long list of all this stuff. By default, it just uses posts in a lot of places, which is really dumb. But all it's doing is just taking the name that you passed in, spaceships. That's all you have to do is just write a function that could do that. So we're going to try to do that with object-oriented programming. And I'm just going to cheat again to show you what we got here. All right. So this is all in one file. We'll move it out in a minute. But so now I have an object here, custom object. I have a name. It cheats. It kind of takes the name and expects you to pass a plural name like spaceships, turns it into singular and plural, passes in the labels and options. But if you don't pass in labels, we actually just set all these default labels using the singular name and the plural name. And this is a really simple example of what you could do. There's a lot more powerful things you could do with this. But you can break apart all these different things that you want to do as you're writing your plugin in an object and then have it as a reusable system. And that's kind of the biggest advantage, because what you want to do here is move this into its own plugin so that you can reuse it multiple times. So I'll show you that one. All right. So in the code now, you've got a spaceships plugin, which just looks like this, and a custom object plugin, which has all that logic. And now we could reuse that over and over. We could make as many different objects as we want, as many different content types as we want in WordPress, and they'd all show up in the side as spaceships on the left-hand side. You could add a new spaceship instead of just adding new posts and pages. You could do this as many times as you want. But the problem right now is if I reload this page, it's definitely going to break, because WordPress handles this auto-loading thing for you. Any plugin that you have activated, it will load all the classes in for you, which is, I guess, okay. But if you don't have that plugin activated, it doesn't load that class. So right now we have this problem where our spaceships plugin says new custom object, but there's no custom object class loaded. And if your client or somebody goes in and deactivates that plugin, what's this custom objects plugin? I don't think I'm using that. And just deactivates it. The whole site blows up, and they can't get back in there to reactivate it because the whole site blew up. So this is kind of identifying a problem with plugin dependencies. Let me go back to my slides here. One solution that you could do is you could use this thing called must-use plugins, which is a little bit of a newer thing. So this is a plugin system here with our several plugins in the folder. If you put another folder in there called mu-plugins, which you can define as something different if you wanted to, but this is by default, that's what it is. Any plugins you put in there are turned on by default and cannot be deactivated by anybody. So they end up being in here, and you got this, the top here, all inactive, must use, and there'll be a list of plugins in here. It's not a great solution right now, because for some reason, it doesn't look in folders in that MU plugins. So you have to have only plugins that are one file each. You could get around this by having one file in there that like requires all the other ones, but it's just kind of terrible. So right now, I'm not really using this. I think they'll probably fix that eventually, but this would be one way you could solve that problem. You could put that custom object class as a must-use plugin, and then it would just be on, and you could rely on it. When I was writing this talk, what I was going to say here was, unfortunately, WordPress doesn't give you any way to set plugins as being dependent on one another. So Drupal has this. You can say this module depends on these other 4 modules, and it'll kind of handle that in a somewhat graceful way. I was going to say WordPress doesn't have it, but then I wanted to make sure, so I researched and actually learned something. So this guy is, his name's Christy Burka. Everywhere online he goes by Scriboo. He's another core developer for WordPress. Another guy that I really think you should read if you're doing any WordPress development. He's really brilliant, doing a ton of stuff on GitHub. Created this thing called he co-created this thing called WP-CLI, which I'll show you if we have time at the end. Just a command line tool set that does a bunch of stuff, so you don't ever have to log into your client's backend just to activate a plugin or something like that. You can just jump in the shell and do it all from there. It's pretty neat. You can actually write your own scripts on it and everything too. But he developed this thing called the Plugin Dependency Management plugin. So got to turn this one on first. But all you do is in that top text area there, you just say this plugin depends on these other plugins. And it handles all of it for you in actually a really nice way. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's go in here. All right. So if we activate plugin dependencies here, it's kind of hard to see. I'll try to make it bigger. So we've got our custom object class. We've got the plugin dependencies and spaceships. And under spaceships, you can see it says you got required plugins. It's blue because we have it here. Got a red dot because it's not turned on. So if you try, as you notice, there's no activate link. It's removed the activate link. So you can't turn this plugin on until you've turned this one on. So once we activate this one, Now it's green here. We've got an activate link. We can do that. I can activate that. And if I try to deactivate this class, it's going to give me a message here. The following plugins have also been deactivated, and it deactivates the other one for you. It's pretty nice. It's still going to break your site if you deactivate a bunch of plugins, but it's at least better. So you can actually determine some dependencies. You can even get a little bit more powerful than this. So this says depends. This is just a string I made up. It's kind of, if you know anything about interfaces in PHP, defining like a traversable interface that something else has to satisfy. This is not that, okay? This is a much weaker version of that. But you can basically define a service or some sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, but a service that a plugin provides that another plugin depends on. So then you could have 20 plugins that provide that service, and all I'm saying in my plugin is I depend on custom objects. As long as you provide the custom object service, you satisfy that requirement. So if you look in the custom object class here, it says provides custom objects. So you can kind of have a two-way street there, and then you can kind of get at something that's close to an adapter pattern interface system. It's not obviously as powerful, but it's a little bit better. It's kind of a nice feature that you do have access to inside there. So this is what I was just talking about, this virtual package idea. So you can interchange what you're using there. You can look at these slides later. All right, so namespacing is a big thing, especially if you're going to use something like Composer. You want a namespace. So you run into a little trouble here. With a namespace, obviously, you're going to depend on, I think it's 5.3, and a lot of WordPress installs are not on 5.3. So this is where you have to kind of make a decision. Is this your site, or is this a site you're deploying for somebody else? But if it's your site, get your site on 5.3, at least. So then you can just add a namespace. What I wanted to point out here in the slide is if you do it this way, without object-oriented plugins, so you're just adding filters with these global functions, you're going to have to actually pass the entire qualified namespace function name. And this is going to get a little bit annoying. It's not that bad, but you're also not gaining much by namespacing your filters without object-oriented plugin classes anyway. So once you do a class, like we were just talking about, then you get this for free, because you can just say array this, my method. So now I'm adding a filter, I'm adding my method name here, and passing it in as a callable. And now I don't have to worry about the namespace, because this way of passing in a filter method is actually going to have the scope implicitly. So you don't need to worry about the namespace. So now what does this do? So namespaces are a way to kind of further encapsulate your code. So I showed you that custom object class here. Custom object is not like an incredibly unique name. So I could call my class JSON Rhodes underscore custom object, and then every time it gets called, you have to use that. Also, the name of my plugin probably now is going to have to reflect that in some way. It's just kind of ugly and hard to maintain. So namespaces will give you a way to create systems of plugins that rely on the namespaces. And you can actually do this in WordPress without any problem as long as you're running 5.3. So if we add .Rhodes JSON WordPress here, and then when we call the class, you can do it one of two ways. I'm going to do it this way. So now I'm saying that's the custom object class I want to use. So now I can just call it that way here. You could also replace this entire line right here and not have this line at all. It's arguable, I guess you could say, why not just name the plugin Rhodes JSON underscore WordPress underscore custom object, kind of doing the same thing. But when we get into auto-loading, which if you start using auto-loading more than just the regular plugin magic auto-loading, if you try to use something like Composer, you load libraries in, you actually can do that without much problem. You can add a few, who's familiar with Composer? So Composer is a system that, if you're not familiar with it, it allows you to download dependencies. It's not for WordPress at all. It's a bunch of tiny libraries or some bigger libraries, and you can just outline a list of libraries that you want your project to depend on, and then from the command line you can download them all from like a central repository where they're all kept, usually on GitHub. If you wanted to use some packages, so you have some plugins you're using, but you're also using some packages that are just from Composer, you can do that, and you can autoload everything with an autoloader that Composer gives you, and you can just require that autoload file in your WP config file. And once you've done that, you have access to everything that you would normally have access to in all your plugins. Again, this is something you have to do with caution because now you rely on something. So if you just try to hand that over to somebody and they accidentally remove that or something, it's a little fragile. But if you're the ones controlling it as a team, you can kind of set that up and you can do it no problem. Let me switch over to this last branch here. So this is exactly what we just did, and if we jump into WordPress, everything's still there. We activate our plugins again. Now we have spaceships. And you can add a new spaceship. So you got all the labels that we passed in, add new spaceship, over here, delete, trash, etc. This is just a really, really simple example of how you can define these custom content types in WordPress. You can do it in an object-oriented way. You can do it with namespacing. You can do quite a bit of work there. Another advantage I wanted to point out that I kind of skipped over before is instead of those weird, like, I need a really, unique namespaced global function, because we're doing this in an object-oriented way, my register function is just register. And like I said, we've got this add action thing here on init. We just pass the register method to the init. It runs this file. It grabs all the stuff that we've saved off previously in the constructor, grabs the options, it grabs the labels with the default labels, and it registers them. And you can do that over and over and over now. You don't have to write this code again. I actually wrote a plugin that does this a couple years ago that also handles, if you're familiar with the meta boxes in WordPress, so on the right-hand side, if you wanted to add custom fields, do a bunch of custom fields on the right for your plugin. So Spaceship has a pilot name or whatever else, fields that you want to define for that content type. The way WordPress handles that, you have to define these things called meta boxes and have them show up somewhere on the page. So when you're editing that content type, they show up on the right. There's a ton of code that you have to write that's just this really boring, long-winded code in order to get a meta box up and running. You can throw that in here as another class, have those two classes talk to each other, and just say new meta box and pass in a couple default options, or a couple specific options that you want, and it'll take care of all the defaults for you. So there's a link to that plugin that I have up on GitHub. You can explore that later if you want. The last thing I want to say about object-oriented too is, so let's say I make this plugin and I put it out there and you want to use it, but you just kind of want to do something slightly different with the default labels. You could just go ahead and extend my class if your plugin depends on mine. Use that plugin dependency module, say it depends on it, make sure it's activated beforehand, and then you could extend the class. You say class my custom object extends the other one, and you can just overwrite that function that sets the default labels, make sure it returns the same kind of array, everything would work fine, and you'd have a nice kind of extendable system there. Whether or not you should do that is something you should think about on a per plugin basis, I should say. But there are times where that would actually give you some advantages. So it's a good thing to think about. Okay, so I'm speeding through this, so I'm going to get some time to kind of show you a couple things at the end here. So these were things I was not going to talk about in great length, but I'll kind of go into them a little bit more. So if you're loading assets, whether it's JavaScript or CSS, there are these enqueue functions, if you're familiar with them. So if your plugin, you want to have a JavaScript file, it's tempting to just add a filter, right, a certain filter in the WP head, and just take whatever that content is and add in your script tag and just dump it on there. What WordPress suggests that you do is say WP register script. You register your script name, where it is, what it depends on, and then you say WP enqueue script, and you enqueue that script. It's like a nice interface to kind of keep you thinking about your dependencies of your script to make sure that it doesn't load two jQueries on the page. It doesn't, by default, do any kind of concatenation or minification, and that seems silly to me. And it doesn't really provide you an API to get at that, that I know of. You can use lots of plugins that are out there that kind of use this stuff and will concatenate and minify your files for you. But what I want to point here, the point of this is that like at some point those functions are going to be piped into some sort of concatenation and minification thing almost certainly. And if you're writing plugins now and you're not taking advantage of this, when that turns over, you have to go back and rewrite your code or whatever. Or I'm not going to use your plugin because if I see you just dumping script tags in the plugin, I don't want that. Because if I want to set up a concatenated minified JavaScript thing, and you're not playing nicely with the enqueue, I can't get at it. So right now, you use enqueue to make sure that you add the scripts and add the CSS in the right way. That way you won't overwrite somebody's. You won't, if you depend on jQuery, you depend on some other library, you won't load it twice on the page, et cetera, et cetera. You can write tests for WordPress, and they do extensively for core. They use PHP unit, which is nice, unlike some other open source ones that are using other things. You can also write QUnit tests. I am not an expert in testing by any means, so I'm not going to dive too deep into that. They don't keep the tests in core because most people wouldn't know what they were or care about them. A WordPress core install is meant to live right in the web root, so it wouldn't really make sense to leave it there. But you can download a different branch from Subversion and grab all the tests and run them. And there's an article I think Smashing Magazine did. It's pretty extensive that I linked to in my notes that goes into how you can do that, how you can write tests for your plugins, and have them kind of run in that same flow. So it's a good idea if you're trying to do testable code. You can do that here as well. Experimenting with WP CLI, I would highly recommend. If you've used Drupal, Drupal has a thing called Drush, D-R-U-S-H, and it's by far the best thing about Drupal. I don't know what that means, but it is a really powerful tool. You can do all kinds of stuff without having to click and click and click on the admin UI. And just recently, a couple of the core developers came out with this WP CLI. It's not official. It's not like an in-core or anything, but core developers are working on it. It's got a lot of buzz. It's been being worked on very frequently, and it has a really cool feature where you can write. So we just talked about object-oriented classes, objects. You can define classes that extend the WP CLI command class, and there's just a whole little API of which methods you have to implement, some sort of interface that you kind of have to satisfy. And if you just implement a couple methods, then all of a sudden you get these commands on the command line that you can run. And I have a kind of a use case for that I'll talk about in a minute. Caching, there's a lot you can do with caching, and you should. WordPress will destroy your CPU and will destroy a server's all kinds of bad things if you're not careful with caching. But you can get away with this with just like a plugin like W3 Total Cache does this pretty well. So if you don't want to write custom caching, you don't have to. What I want to say is if you do want to write custom caching, you can, and there's actually some really interesting ways to do it. WordPress has an object cache built into it that it's using on every page load, but it's just dumping it into PHP memory. So PHP memory is not persistent, so it just goes away as soon as that page is over. If you tap into that, there's a full API called an object cache API. So you can pass it APC. You can say, hey, I have APC. Here's the functions I want you to run. And it will store all of its object cache in APC for you. And you can set how long you want it to run, and you can speed up all your sites that way. Mark Jakewith, who I mentioned before, has a plugin called APC Object Cache or something. You can enable that, or you can read through it and see how it happens. I just kind of learned this recently, too. I had no idea. It's a pretty awesome, powerful tool. If you're going to write WordPress code, try where you can to use the APIs. I'll mention more about that in a second. A couple more slides here. Last thing is deploy smart. So I'm going to talk about these last two things in more detail since I have some time. These are the APIs. There may be one or two more that aren't on here. I'll put the link. The link is in my notes, so you can go to this page. You can read about every single one of these. Some I'll point out. HTTP. So if you wanted to make requests, so say you're writing a widget that hits the Twitter API and pulls in all your latest tweets. You don't want to use curl or fopen because, again, you don't know what server this site's going to end up on. So if you're going to write a plugin that you want to be available, you may want to make it available to people who don't have those things available on their servers. HTTP API has just a couple methods that you'd expect, remote get, remote post, remote request, and it takes care of checking for what things are available and then making the right kind of request depending on what that is. What's really neat about this is right now I write a lot of code for Composer, writing small libraries, and it really irritates me when I load a library for Twitter or whatever, and it has an HTTP library inside of it. That's not the one I'm already using, so now I've got two in my code. So we try to make sure that if we write like a Twitter library or Instagram library, that we make it so that you can pass in your own HTTP library if you want. You're already using one. You could very easily write that same kind of adapter system around their APIs, and then these things would play nicely. So a Composer library may be a lot closer to being ready to just use inside of a plugin than you think. A couple other ones, this transients API is like a database cache. So it uses the really crazy options table, which is just a key value kind of store in SQL, and you can give it a TTL. So you can say, only keep this in the database for a minute or 2 minutes or whatever. Again, whether or not you should do that is something you need to consider, but it's there. The rest of these I'd say just go ahead and take a look. Some of them are more powerful than others, but if you're going to do anything, make sure you check this first, because there may be something that already exists that already plays well within how WordPress works. And the one thing that I always try to remember is if you fight against WordPress, you fight against Drupal, these things that are kind of big, they kind of have some opinions, the less you fight against it, the less problems you're going to have. So the last thing I want to talk about is deployment. I'm really passionate about deployment. I submitted a talk completely about that, but I'll just touch on it briefly. We used Capistrano to deploy all of our applications. Has anyone used Capistrano here?
Only through WebStream.
What's that?
Only through WebStream.
Okay. Well, we can use it for anything. It's written in Ruby. It came out of the Rails community, but you can use it for anything, and you only need Ruby on your local machine that you're running. You don't need to install Ruby anywhere else for it to work. And how it works is I just jump on the command and I say cap deploy. And since I have all my code on GitHub, I've told Capistrano where my code is, what the GitHub repository is, which branch I want it to use. And so it logs in via SSH into the remote server. And it jumps into the folder that I told it to, which is my site, the root. And it does this kind of stuff. So if you look at this first, what it's going to do is going to go into the releases folder, and it's going to download the latest copy from that branch, from GitHub. And it's going to call that folder by the timestamp of when it pulled it down. So right now, your site's still alive in the old version. Nothing else has happened. It's just a new copy is in this releases folder. And you can tell it how many of these you want to keep. So I keep 10. It'll delete everything after 10. Then it's going to ask you, what do you want me to do? And you can tell it, I want you to run these 10 tasks. So I'll give you some examples in a second. But you can have it run any task on that remote server. Move some files around, point some symlinks, copy some settings files, et cetera, et cetera. Once it's done doing all that, it tells you all the things, all the progress. Then it just points this symlink, current, to the latest one. So it just points it over. If your site blows up, you say cat rollback, and it's immediately back to the old version. You don't have to upload more code and wait for it, because all it has to do is point the symlink at this folder instead. So it's super fast. You can do tons of stuff. So I keep like my local database settings in like an environment settings file. And then when I deploy, I have a task that I wrote in Capistrano that looks on the production server for a production settings file and just copies it over, moves it over to that settings file. So now the settings that WordPress is looking for are the correct settings. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with that, and it's really powerful. You can set up a staging recipe and a production. They're called recipes in Capistrano, so it's a set of tasks. So a staging recipe, a production recipe. You can do database servers with it, so you can push out database migrations all from one. It opens up threads too, so it's not like you're waiting for this server and then this server and then this server. It just pushes it all out at once. So it's really fast, it's really powerful. If you have never used it and you're doing any kind of deployment where you're jumping onto a server and copying and pasting, or FTP or SSH yourself manually, don't do that because robots do it better. Okay, if it's automated, you should let a robot do it. Robots love automation, and we mess it up all the time. So this is really powerful. So this is what the tasks look like. So I have a symlink task that takes that files folder. Because so in the repository, if I have a GitHub repository where I have my WordPress files, I don't want to have all the uploads, all the uploaded images in my repository. Every time I deploy, it's going to be an empty folder, and all those files are going to be gone from the server. So I don't have it in there. I actually have it in this folder down here called shared, which is a Capistrano thing. So this is where all those uploaded files go. And this directory is just symlinked into the current folder where WordPress normally expects that uploads folder to be. So I have to every time remove that symlink to the right one. So again, I just write a task. I say, after you deploy, before you move the main symlink to the current, just change this one too. It has these little variables in Capistrano to kind of the shared path, so that shared folder, wherever it is, I don't have to write out the whole path in the server. I just have a little placeholder that I can do. And this is some settings files. This is moving the production settings over to where the local settings were. This is what they look like. I encourage you to look into it more if you're interested in deployment at all. Don't panic is the main key here. That's on the cover of the Hitchhiker's Guide. There's a lot here, so if you're kind of like, whoa, I was expecting some tips on writing better themes. Obviously, maybe this is not exactly what you're interested in, but if you're writing plugins, you can do a lot of this stuff, and this just kind of presents a lot of decisions. Like I said, is it the right thing? Should I do this? Is this going to actually help me? Am I just doing it to be cool or something? The goal is to just pick what you're familiar with and do it, and try to learn more things as you can. I kind of just hope to show you guys that there are things that are possible inside of a WordPress context that maybe you didn't think were possible. The last thing I wanted to quickly say about deployment, if you're not into like the whole SSH thing, you're like, I use shared servers, I use Bluehost, I have to do FTP, so I use CyberDuck, and I just dump it up, or transmit or something. I do that for my freelance projects a lot. So I have a client, they're paying for their server, it's on some third party, I can't use Capistrano because I don't have SSH access. There's a thing called Get FTP. You set your FTP credentials once for the project, and then you just do on the command line get FTP push after you've committed a bunch of changes, and it just pushes up, it knows the diff, so it knows exactly what files changed, and it just pushes those files across FTP. A lot faster. You never have to log into FTP again. I hate logging into FTP. You don't have to worry about it. You just develop locally, do your testing there, you get FTP push, pushes it up to the other server. So that's something else to check out. So that's my talk. That's where you can rate it. I'm sure you guys have seen the joined in link, so I'd really appreciate that. This is the first big talk I've given at a PHP conference. I really love your feedback. I've got notes, I've got slides, I've got all the links that I mentioned here, so you can go there too. Any questions? Yeah.
I've got a couple questions. Hopefully, use Sublime Text and starting to use that to use plugins for WordPress.
You asked about using Sublime Text and if they're plugins for WordPress. I don't use them. I tried. There was a WordPress autocomplete, but the autocomplete plugins for Sublime drive me like nuts. They just keep trying to make me do like I end a command that I meant to end, and then it just adds like a bunch of underscores at the end for some other random command. So I wasn't really nuts about it.
I was just watching the typer, and I know some of that stuff came up quick when I typed.
Oh, some of that was I was switching branches inside of Git and cheating. But yeah.
That skeleton, is that the one that gave you the nice old structure? Is that part of the deal there?
Yeah, so WordPress Skeleton is Mark Jakewith's example, so you can download that from there and you can mess with it. But he does it one way. I kind of do it slightly differently. I've just kind of been playing with it, but that's one way you could do it. And just kind of demonstrate some cool things you can do with the content folder and having WordPress as a submodule.
Okay, two more real quick.
Uh-huh.
I put a PHP out now in the years. Some of the things that it's always been a mishmash about the packaging. I was kind of stuck in the settlement here.
Yep.
And then Titus came along and went. I can't quite figure that out. Now it's Composer.
Yeah.
Is Composer going to be the latest greatest thing? Is that what they're using PHP packaging? Kind of like the equivalent of Ruby is.
Yeah, kind of. It's so Composer versus Pear and Pickle, or say it. Composer is really about dependency management, so it's not really trying to be. It's saying it's not trying to be a package manager, so it's not for global packages. So you still want to use Pear or Pickle if you've got to download stuff that's for your global system, mostly. There's obviously overlap, but what they're trying to do is Composer is per project. So this project depends on these 3 libraries. Download it for this exact thing, which is kind of more like what NPM or Gem is doing for Ruby and Node.
And then finally, we had some boilerplate there. I didn't even look together. When I poke around WordPress, they have a plugin that comes with WordPress all the time. I hate to say it's called Global.
Yeah.
And I've got Reliable Server really good template for plugins. Is that something you use, or you just kind of put together a template for a plugin?
Yeah, I mean, I've got my own if I use it usually by this point. But if you just check the codex and look up, there's an article called "Writing a Plugin," and they have a whole like all that boilerplate right there. That's what I would grab because I'm not sure what's in Hello.A at this point. So I don't know if that's a good thing to start out with or not. Anyone else? Yeah.
You talked about deploying code, so like several different environments. When you use a database, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, right. It's a good question. That's one of the biggest things that I think we need to solve if we're going to use WordPress for applications. And WP CLI, I think, is the first step. We do this with Drupal installs at Johns Hopkins. We can leverage the command line to pull out database saved options and save them in text. And so when we deploy, we can check that, and then we can kind of reanimate that on the production server. There's an options API, so all those options that you would set for a WordPress install, you can get at really easily with the WP CLI options. So you can write your own set of commands, extending the WP CLI command class that checks through a list of options that you've designated as being volatile, or you can just do them all. Again, I don't have a great solution for that right now. Right now it's make a change, go on to production, click the change over. It's terrible. So I think we need to fix that. But I think WP CLI and some kind of deployment script that runs like Capistrano does to check that stuff and kind of sync those things across. Really, I think the end goal is to stop putting options in the database, but that's something else.
You just mentioned Capistrano, you have the database connection to the database. So if you want to put record every change you made to an option and just
Yep. Yep.
put it in your update script for the next release.
Yep.
And when you release, it's automatically set to the correct value.
So if you're managing your databases with Capistrano 2, you can kind of record all the changes that your database has made, and then use it as kind of like a content migration instead of a schema migration. Yeah.
You were talking about don't write to the function file, write plugins.
Yeah.
And thereafter you brought up the point of like, well, people can disable plugins, and that's my reasoning for writing in the function file. More specifically regarding localization of code, I use includes in there, so I can choose
Yep.
including each one. But why is it that you prefer plugins over something in that function file that isn't allowed to be disabled?
So why use plugins over functions when plugins are a little volatile because you can disable them? I like the modular aspect of plugins that you get for free. When I open up a theme and it's got a bunch of functions that are in folders inside of other folders that are required, it kind of just makes me real nervous and we feel scared. So part of it, I guess, is personal preference, but part of it is I think the plugin system is meant to be the module system for WordPress. So again, I'm trying not to fight against it. I also think functions.php file is tied to the theme, so I don't like the idea of having to pull all that shit out and put it over into another theme just because I want to change what the theme looks like. And then you get into weird things like, well, I could include it like outside of WP content, and then you're really in bad shape. So I think plugins provide a nice modular system, and as we write better code, like people like Scribu writing that plugin dependency module, we're getting that for free. And if you've written everything in functions, you're going to be off on the side being very sad instead of being able to participate in, I think, where everything's going. So that's kind of why I think. So do you mean if someone updates a plugin via the UI on the production server? Yeah, so you just have, if you're going to use Capistrano, you're obviously in control of you got to be in control of your environment, which is why often you can't do that. But like for us, you don't update stuff on production. It's just the rule. Yeah. So no code changes happen on production, only content changes there. So database can come down, so I can get the latest database. All code goes this direction. We just keep that as a hard and fast rule. Yeah.
Is there a way to write a plugin that doesn't show up in that UI?
So the must-use plugins are the best thing, the closest thing to that. So it moves it over,
There's no way to
but you can't make it a hidden thing.
like that.
No.
No keylogger plugin.
No. Yeah.
Do you know of a really good way to manage dependencies in a theme that depends on a plugin?
Managing dependencies on a theme. Themes depending on plugins, not depending on like child and parent themes, but no. So those APIs I showed you, where are they? So this one here, this file header API is how WordPress reads in that key value text store. So you can access this completely yourself. So you could write a plugin that checks the theme stuff, and you could do that same depends system. You could implement depends at the top of your style sheet where you're saying like the theme name or whatever it's called. I don't like it being there. I kind of wish in that case that stuff was in the functions.php file. But right now WordPress requires you to put that in the style sheet. I think Scribe is actually working on this. So if you check out that plugin, I think there's an issue about that exact thing. They're having that same conversation. Should it be in functions? Should it be in the style sheet? But you could leverage the same header API that's being used to read in that stuff in the plugin. You could read it in from the theme too, and then kind of manage across those two UI pages and have it be the same exact thing. Anyone else? All right, thanks guys. Please rate my talk.